animated map, some fire, whatever those spinning metal things are, and that cello melody. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, that unmistakable intro is your cue to get your thrones on. In an era when a TV show can't be taken seriously unless it has an overly elaborate animated title sequence, Game of Thrones still sits above the pack. In my opinion, one of the reasons why Game of Thrones, winner of the 2011 Emmy for Best Titles Design, has been so successful and influential is just how good this main music theme is. So I thought, in a first for me in this channel, I'd break it all down for you. The Game of Thrones main theme. What makes it so good? First of all, let's talk a little bit about TV title themes. Title themes work a little differently to the rest of the soundtrack. Usually we hear music supporting the drama or action of the actors on screen.
And winter is coming.
The theme to the main title, on the other hand, is more about creating an overall recognisable brand, as well as preparing the audience for the mood of the show to come. The Game of Thrones theme was immediately successful in both of these functions. In terms of branding, it was an immediate hit, spawning an improbable number of covers and parodies within days of release. In my memory, it's the most successful and instantly recognisable theme since we were all whistling the X-Files theme back in 1994. Incidentally, the X-Files was also winner of the Emmy for Main Title Design. As for preparing the audience for the show, I think there's 4 aspects of the Game of Thrones theme that work particularly well. Firstly, energy. It has a rollicking, drinking song-like tempo that adds much needed momentum to the animation of the title sequence. Secondly, it has a hummable and highly memorable melody. Thirdly, it has a distinct, unique sound, which is also appropriate for the fantasy setting. And finally, the overall mood of the piece. It just feels very adventurous and epic. So that's what I think the theme does very well, but how does it do this? First, let's quickly talk about structure. The structure of the main theme is deceptively simple. In fact, there's just 3 main musical elements to the theme. Firstly, we have the riff. Then we have the melody. And finally, we have a sweeping B melody. As we'll soon see as we look more closely at the track, these 3 elements are used as building blocks for the entire theme. So let's break down each element one by one. Firstly, we'll start with the riff. Everything about the main theme to Game of Thrones literally starts and ends with the strings riff. Much like the structure, the first remarkable thing to say about the riff is just how simple it is. Really, it's just 2 elements, a downward leap followed by a climb. That's it. 2 different components, creating a sense of constant climbing and striving. The only variation we ever get is the simple slowing of the rhythm, achieved by removing one of the notes at the end of the section. It's just a little musical punctuation. Even there, while the rhythm is technically slower, Giroudi adds strong accents in the drums, which actually serve to drive the music into the next section. This constant forwards and upwards motion is the source of the main title's powerful momentum and energy. It's also an example of that old engineering maxim that something is only finished when you have nothing left to take away. This short phrase is everything you need to make an effective and most importantly memorable riff. It has a balance between a strong leap and a weaker stepwise motion, and absolutely nothing else. For a very similar example, consider the equally memorable riff of the White Stripes Seven Nation Army. That does essentially the same thing, only in Seven Nations Army, the riff is relentlessly descending as opposed to the rising of the Game of Thrones riff. Another reason why the riff is so memorable is repetition. Giroudi beats us over the head with it. We hear the riff through almost the entire title track, 91 times over the course of the 100-second title sequence. And that's not even counting sections where the rhythm of the riff continues in the drum while the riff isn't actually playing in the strings. Now we've just talked about the basic contour, repetition and memorableness of the riff, but to delve any deeper we're going to have to talk about some music theory. We need to talk about harmony. Don't worry, I'll keep this as painless as possible, but I do warn you that we're going to have to unleash my dodgy piano keyboard graphic. Harmonically, the riff is based entirely around a simple triad chord. Starting in the key of C minor, the first note we hear is a G. Then we have the drop, down to our chordal root of C, and it then jumps up a third, E flat, before climbing back up to the fifth, G, only to drop again into the cycle. These three notes, C, E flat, and G, are the most basic root position triad of the C minor scale. The interest comes in variation. Right from the beginning, Djibouti starts to mess with this. After hearing it normally 4 times, we suddenly get a change. That middle note shifts from an E flat to an E natural. That means now we're hearing a C major chord, a much brighter and livelier sound. This alternation between major and minor continues throughout the piece. Much like a pop song, the Game of Thrones theme is built on a chord progression, and the riff, which as I said earlier plays constantly through the title, changes to whatever chord the piece is currently in. When it is minor, we get the minor thirds, and when it is major, we hear the major ones. Think of it like Littlefinger, constantly changing its tune to whatever else is going on at the time. For example, during the B melody section in the second half of the track, we hear the riff go through this chord progression. Musically speaking, the following of the chords means the riff also acts as an arpeggio. Arpeggios, the playing of notes of a chord separately rather than together, are a distinctive feature of old Baroque and classical music. Using this technique helps subconsciously add some age to the music and is part of why it feels so appropriate for the fantasy knights and castles setting. A final point to make about the riff is instrumentation. The riff is played primarily in the upper strings, violins and violas, and is supported throughout the piece with percussion. The percussion is mainly large drums, probably taiko drums or tom-toms. Whatever they are, in both sound and rhythm they sit cunningly between being Renaissance-era dance drums and thundering tribal war drums. Both are highly energetic and nicely match the setting and overall theme of a show based around books with titles such as A Dance with Dragons. Now let's move along to that amazing cello melody. Just like the riff, the melody is effective despite, and in fact because, of its simplicity. It's very distinctive, memorable, and in something of a holy grail for TV and movie themes, it's extremely hummable. And now for the potentially mind-blowing fact, because you see, the melody is the riff. Or more accurately, it's a series of variations on the riff. Over the course of the main melody, we essentially hear the riff 4 times. 4 times we hear that drop of a perfect fifth, and all 4 times it's followed by a pair of semiquavers. At the risk of overanalyzing it, okay, too late now, what we hear is the riff going through a pop song-like 4-chord progression. Beyond the changing chords, the other obvious variation is in the direction of the semiquavers, where in the first half of the melody they step upwards, in the second half they step down. Another notable feature of the melody is its very narrow range. Just 6 notes separate its highest note G and the lowest B flat. Now most books in musical theory would tell you that this is bad melody writing. Starting a phrase on the highest note is a complete no-no. The reason why is because it leads to a melody with no climax. It's constantly moving but never really going anywhere. But rather than being a mistake, this is actually a masterstroke that really ties this melody into the themes of the show. For a start, it mirrors the story arc of so many of the characters. Falling, sometimes literally, then having to climb, sometimes literally, only to fall again. There's a Sisyphean quality to it as well, constantly striving but never getting anywhere. Alternatively, rather than climbing, you could hear the melody as rotating, like the gears in the title sequence, or the rotation of the seasons that Ned is so obsessed about. It even ties in with the show's metaphor of the struggle for the throne as being like a wheel.
Lannister, Targaryen, Baratheon, Stark, Tyrell. They're all just spokes on a wheel. This one's on top, then that one's on top, and on it spins, crushing those on the ground.
A final interesting point about the melody is its interaction with the riff. It's a basic call and response. We hear the first half of the melody, then it pauses for the riff to respond. Because of how similar the melody is to the riff, it results in a sound not unlike a folk song or a sea shanty, genuine adventuring music. We hear the melody 3 times, each time growing in instrumentation. First, played by a solo cello, then by a cello and violin together. And finally, in full strings. As an interesting aside, one thing we never hear is brass. Horns and trumpets are a staple of fantasy and medieval settings, usually playing grand in heroic fanfares. The lack of these instruments, and the lack of fanfares in general, tells us that while this may be an epic fantasy world with dragons and knights, we shouldn't be expecting those knights to don their shiny armour and save the day anytime soon. And now, finally, we come to the B section. I think this is the most beautiful part of the track, even though it's the part that's probably least stuck in the mind of the audience. The melody of the B section is played in the lower strings. It's a very basic melody, just a single note per bar. For the musicians out there, it functions somewhere between a Baroque cantus firmus and the bridge section of a modern song. Alongside the theme, the riff continues relentlessly, forming chords out of the melody notes and still alternating between major and minor. The second time through the B section, the strings are joined by women's choir. Their high descant line is reminiscent of Western sacred music. Descant lines are high choral parts that seem to soar over the top of the underlying melody. They feel almost like choirs of angels singing from the heavens. They are common in music composed for performance in grand cathedrals. They have this extraordinary quality of instinctively drawing the eyes of the churchgoers upwards towards the amazing windows and ceilings of the cathedral. In the context of the Game of Thrones theme, this section adds to the drama and generally epic quality of the track. And now finally to the Coda. It's just the riff, but played in a combination of 2 rather unusual instruments. We have a dulcimer, an old stringed instrument traditional to many different cultures. Basically, it's a small harp sitting sideways on a box. And then, and I apologise for my pronunciation of this, we have a kantele, a very similar instrument from Finland. The shimmering and exotic sound of these instruments adds a sense of mystery. It's a musical question mark, and it leads us right into the episode. And that's it, a complete breakdown of the Game of Thrones theme and what makes it so effective. I hope you've liked it and perhaps have learned something new about this fantastic piece of television music. For more information about this video and for a link to an even more in-depth blog post, check out the links in the description. Please share your thoughts about the Game of Thrones theme in the comments, and let me know what you thought about this video and what pieces you'd like me to break down next. And finally, don't forget to subscribe. I'm hoping to bring you lots more great breakdowns, reviews and other content in the near future. But until then, goodbye.